Look at a map of Texas. There's a single highway that generates nearly half the state's GDP. Not Houston's port, not the Permian oil fields. A stretch of interstate called I-35 running from Laredo up and through Austin to Dallas. Half the economy of the 8th largest country-sized economy on Earth lined up along one road. But here's what's stranger. Drive 1 hour west of that highway and Texas just ends. Population densities drop to under 10 people per square mile. Entire counties start losing residents even when the rest of the state is booming. The line splitting Texas runs right down I-35. And what drew it isn't political. It's a combination of old rivers, older soil, and a 20th century invention nobody thinks of as life-changing. Pull up a map of Texas and draw a line connecting 4 cities. Dallas-Fort Worth in the north, Houston on the east, San Antonio in the south, and Austin right between them. What you've just sketched is a rough wedge. Geographers call it the Texas Triangle, and it's one of the most unbalanced population shapes in the country. Inside that wedge live about 23 million people, packed into an area smaller than most individual US states. Those 4 metros alone generate around 77% of Texas's entire economic output. Combined, they produce roughly $1.5 trillion a year, an economy the size of Spain, tucked inside one corner of one US state. Now look at what's outside the triangle. West of I-35, the density collapses almost immediately. Whole counties fall below 10 people per square mile, a threshold that puts them closer to parts of Mongolia than to the rest of America. You can drive for 2 hours and pass 3 towns, a gas station, and a lot of fence line. The scale of the imbalance is hard to picture until you see it. Roughly 85% of Texans live inside a shape that takes up about a quarter of the state. The rest of Texas is enormous, beautiful, and almost empty. So the puzzle is simple. Why did nearly every Texan, given an area the size of France to choose from, end up inside the same wedge? The obvious answer is that cities attract people. But that just pushes the question back a layer. Why did these 4 cities grow? And why did no Amarillo, no Lubbock, no Midland ever rise to challenge them? The line wasn't drawn in the 20th century. It was drawn almost 200 years ago by the one thing every early Texan needed most. Before railroads, before oil, before highways, the only question that mattered in Texas was whether the ground would give you enough rain to grow food. And the geography of rainfall across Texas is ruthless. Moisture rolls in off the Gulf of Mexico and drops its cargo in the eastern half of the state. By the time that air reaches the west, there's nothing left. The rainfall line tilts steadily downward as you move across the map, about 50 inches a year near the Louisiana border, falling to 30 inches near Austin, and collapsing to less than 15 inches in West Texas. That gradient decided where the first permanent settlements could survive. Spanish missions in the 1700s anchored themselves along the rivers of the east and south, the Colorado, the Brazos, the San Antonio. Mexican land grants in the 1820s and 1830s kept handing out parcels along the same corridor, because that's where crops would grow and cattle could drink. When Anglo settlers flooded in after independence, they followed the same logic. Cotton plantations spread across the fertile Blackland prairie east of Austin. Timber came out of the piney woods, farms thickened along rivers and creeks, and small towns sprouted at the crossings. In the far south, something different happened. Captain Richard King and Mifflin Kennedy bought up Spanish-era land grants by the hundreds of thousands of acres, using a Mexican land unit called the sitio, each one measuring about 4,605 acres. By stacking sitios into single ownership blocks, they built ranches the size of small states. The King Ranch today still covers more territory than Rhode Island. That pattern told you something important about South and West Texas. The economy there was going to be built on land, not towns. A handful of families, a lot of cattle, and miles of open range in between. Meanwhile, the railroads reinforced what rain had already started. Rail lines followed population, and population followed water. So the first great Texas rail network wove through Houston, Galveston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin. By 1910, only 24% of Texans lived in cities, But the cities that existed were almost entirely inside what we now call the Triangle. The line had already been sketched in pencil before most of the state had electricity. But while the east was slowly thickening with towns and rails, the west was doing something stranger. It was producing wealth without producing people. Somewhere around the 100th meridian, a faint vertical line that cuts through the middle of Texas, the climate shifts from humid to arid, and it doesn't shift back. West of that line, rainfall isn't just low, it's unreliable. A wet year can double a dry year. Farmers can't plant a crop around averages when the averages lie to you every other season. The only reason any large-scale farming happens on the high plains at all is an invisible reservoir called the Ogallala Aquifer. It stretches beneath 8 states, and a chunk of it sits under the Texas Panhandle. For most of history, it was untouchable. Then in the 20th century, cheap electric pumps and center pivot irrigation let farmers reach down hundreds of feet and pull that water to the surface. Circular green fields of cotton, corn, and sorghum suddenly appeared in places that looked like desert from an airplane. The aquifer made West Texas productive, but it didn't make West Texas populated. A single irrigated quarter section needs 1 farmer, not 20. Ranching did the same thing at a bigger scale. Out where rainfall is thin, a cow needs a lot of land to find enough grass. That simple ecological fact means the economics of ranching push hard toward consolidation. One family with 50,000 acres is more viable than 50 families with 1,000 acres each. So West Texas developed an economy where a small number of owners controlled immense stretches of land, and the population per square mile stayed low by structural necessity, not accident. And then came the weirdest twist of all: oil. When the Permian Basin in West Texas started producing in the early 20th century, it became one of the richest oil fields in the world. You'd expect that kind of wealth to build cities. It didn't. Oil is capital intensive, not labor intensive. A modern pump jack runs on its own. A rig crew might be 20 people. A field that pumps billions of dollars a year employs fewer workers than a single Houston office tower. The money flowed out of the ground, up pipelines and into refineries hundreds of miles away on the Gulf Coast. West Texas got the wells. Houston got the workers. That's the real reframe of the West. It wasn't empty because nobody wanted it. It was empty because the economics of the land punished density. Cattle, cotton under irrigation, oil, every major industry out there produces enormous wealth while needing very few people to produce it. So if the West was already structured to stay empty and the East was already structured to grow, and if you enjoy this kind of hidden geography story, subscribing helps these keep coming. The 20th century should have just accelerated what was already there. And at first, that's exactly what it did. The first half of the 20th century poured fuel on the Triangle. When Permian crude came out of the ground, it didn't stay in Odessa or Midland. It moved east through pipelines to Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Corpus Christi, where refineries cracked it into gasoline and chemicals for the world. That meant the workers, the engineers, the corporate offices, and the port infrastructure all clustered on the Gulf Coast. Every barrel pulled from West Texas deepened Houston instead of filling the town that sat on top of the well. Then World War II arrived, and the federal government started writing checks the size of cities. Fort Bliss expanded around El Paso. Randolph, Lackland, and Kelly airfields turned San Antonio into one of the largest military training hubs in the country. Camp Hood, now Fort Cavazos, sprawled across central Texas. Shipyards at Houston, Beaumont, and Orange built warships and tankers on an assembly line scale. Factories in Dallas and Fort Worth rolled out aircraft and components for the war effort. Rural Texans poured into these cities looking for steady wages, and most of them never went back. The state urbanized faster in a decade than it had in the previous 50 years. West Texas got its own booms in the same period. The Permian pulsed through the 1920s, crashed, surged again after the war, crashed again in the 80s, and so on. Every cycle pulled workers in and then spit them back out. Boomtowns like Odessa and Midland grew and shrank in waves. Permanent population never really anchored. You can see it today in the drive between Midland and Odessa. stretches of abandoned man camps, empty RV parks, storefronts that open and close with the oil price. So by 1950, the story looks nearly complete. The East had water, rivers, railroads, refineries, military bases, and factories. The West had oil, cattle, and enormous distances between anything. Most of the triangle was already taking shape. You could tell someone that oil and war explain why Texas is lopsided, and they'd nod. But they shouldn't. Because oil and war explain why Houston and Dallas got bigger. They don't explain why millions of people were suddenly willing to live there year-round. For that, you need one invention. And in 1954, engineers in Austin ran an experiment to prove it would work. Before the 1950s, summer in Houston was genuinely punishing. Temperatures hit the mid-90s, humidity hovered near saturation, and the heat didn't break at night. You can read it in the architecture that survives. Walk through the old Houston Heights and look at the Victorians built before World War II. You'll see 14-foot ceilings designed to pull hot air up and away from the living space. You'll see transom windows over every doorway to keep air moving through the house. You'll see sleeping porches wrapped around the back, screened-in rooms where families literally slept outside on the hottest nights because the indoor bedrooms were unbearable. That architecture is a confession. It's the shape of a city that didn't know how to be comfortable yet. Then in 1954, a group of engineers and researchers in Austin built a subdivision that looked, from the curb, completely ordinary. Ranch homes, trimmed lawns, kids on bikes. They called it the air-conditioned village. But every one of those houses had been wired with experimental central air conditioning, and researchers were quietly watching what people would do if they lived permanently in 72-degree comfort. They tracked sleep patterns, cooking habits, how long families spent in each room, what time they went outside. They were running a living experiment on the question of whether humans could actually inhabit the Gulf Coast climate year-round if you gave them refrigerated air to come home to. The answer was yes. Emphatically, transformatively, yes. Within a generation, central AC moved from a luxury to a standard feature. And every humid southern city that had been grudgingly livable for 6 months a year became comfortable for 12. And when that happened in Texas, the effect was explosive. Between roughly 1950 and today, the state's population grew by around 170%. And the overwhelming majority of that growth flowed into the 4 metros of the Triangle. Houston went from a sweaty port town of 600,000 to a metro of over 7 million. The Triangle didn't grow because Texans invented new industries. It grew because the cities that already existed suddenly became places you could live without suffering. Here's the cleanest way to say it. Houston without air conditioning is not a megacity. It's a port with a brutal 9-month summer. The machine that picked the winter in Texas isn't visible from the road, and most people don't even think of it as infrastructure. But every time you hear a compressor kick on in a Triangle kitchen, that's the sound of the line being drawn. And once AC let the East grow without limits, the West's stagnation wasn't just a historical accident anymore. It became a permanent condition. The numbers that followed were brutal. Here's a statistic that sounds like it has to be wrong. Between 2000 and 2010, Texas added 4.5 million people, one of the largest population surges in modern American history. During that same decade, 79 Texas counties lost residents, not a handful. Almost a third of the state was shrinking while the state as a whole was booming. And when you plot those 79 counties on a map, they form a shape, a giant crescent wrapping around the Triangle, almost all of it west of I-35. The years 2000 to 2010 were an oil boom in West Texas. Fracking was transforming the Permian. Wells were producing at record rates. And yet the towns above those wells kept leaking people. The reason is the same reason we saw earlier, just sharper. Every decade, the machinery of West Texas gets more efficient and needs fewer humans. A modern ranch runs on fewer hands than it did 50 years ago. A center pivot irrigation system waters a circle of crops with the press of a button. Oil rigs are automated, remotely monitored, and manned by crews that fly in for 2-week shifts and fly out again. the wealth still comes out of the ground. The people don't stay above it. And life in the emptying counties gets harder each year as the population thins. Residents in some western counties now drive more than an hour to reach a hospital, a pediatrician, or a clothing store. Schools consolidate across 3 towns because none of them can fill a classroom on their own. Main streets that had barbershops and grocery stores in 1970 have neither now. It's the slow bleed pattern, not a collapse, just a steady drain. Meanwhile, the triangle is pulling people toward itself at an almost absurd rate. Suburbs around Austin sprout subdivisions on pasture that was empty 5 years ago. Frisco, outside Dallas, went from 33,000 people in 2000 to over 200,000 today. The gap isn't closing, it's widening with every census, and the triangle isn't just pulling people, it's become one of the largest commercial corridors on the continent, organized around the single highway we started with. I-35 runs 588 miles through Texas, from the border at Laredo up through San Antonio, Austin, Waco, and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Along that corridor lives most of the state's economy. Roughly 1.6 million jobs sit within a short drive of the highway. More than $300 billion in trade moves along it every year, including a significant share of all U.S.-Mexico truck freight, which crosses the border at Laredo and heads north. And when economists measure the share of Texas GDP generated by the I-35 corridor, the number lands near 49%. Almost half the economy of the 8th largest country-sized economy on Earth lined up along one road. Together with I-45, which connects Houston to Dallas, and I-10, which connects Houston to San Antonio, I-35 forms the spine of the Texas Triangle. Every new Amazon fulfillment center, every Samsung chip fab, every Tesla assembly plant, every master planned suburb gets built somewhere near that spine. Warehouses by the millions of square feet line the frontage roads. Logistics parks sprawl across fields that grew corn a decade ago. The corridor keeps thickening, and every dollar of investment that lands along it makes the next dollar more likely to land there too. The same self-reinforcing gravity that built the triangle in the first place, now running at full speed. But the same forces that made the triangle dominant are running out. And what's running out first is the thing that made the West habitable in the first place. The Ogallala Aquifer, the water table that made high plains farming possible in the first place, is dropping. In parts of the Texas Panhandle, the water level has fallen by more than 150 feet since large-scale irrigation began. In some counties, farmers are already giving up on irrigated crops and reverting to dryland farming, which yields less and pays worse. The aquifer was built by the last ice age. It refills at the pace of rainfall, and the pumps are drawing it down faster than any realistic rainfall could replace it. Over a long enough timeline, parts of West Texas are reverting to what they were before irrigation arrived, harder to farm, thinner on people with shrinking economies. The political math makes the problem worse. Representation and infrastructure dollars follow GDP, and GDP is inside the triangle. Rural West Texas counties have the land but not the votes. When decisions get made in Austin about water rights, highway funds, rural hospital subsidies, and broadband expansion, the Triangle's priorities carry the day. Rural hospitals across West Texas have been closing for a decade. Every closure makes the surrounding area a little less viable. Every less viable town loses a few more residents. The downward spiral that we saw in the emptying counties has an engine, and the engine is political weight following economic weight. Climate projections sharpen the divergence. Hotter, drier summers don't hurt the triangle as much. Those cities are built around refrigerated air and imported water. They hurt the West, where the land itself still has to carry the weight. The place that has always needed geography to cooperate is losing geography's cooperation. And that brings us back to the highway we started on. I-35 isn't just a road. It's the visible scar of every force we just traced. The rivers that told Spanish settlers where to build missions. The soil that told cotton farmers where to plant. The railroads that stitched the fertile East into a network. The pipelines that routed West Texas oil into Gulf Coast refineries instead of High Plains towns. The military bases that turned wartime boomtowns into permanent cities. And above all, the machine that most people don't think of as infrastructure, the refrigerated air that finally made those humid summers survivable year-round. Every one of those forces concentrated its effects along the same north-south corridor. That's why a single stretch of interstate now generates half the state's economy. The line splitting Texas isn't political. It's not cultural. It's 588 miles of concrete, and it got drawn by water, oil, and refrigerated air over the course of 200 years. Everything west of that line is what Texas looked like before the machines arrived. Enormous, resource-rich, and built to stay empty. Everything east of it is what the machines build. Thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed this one, the videos on screen are worth your time. Consider subscribing to catch the next one.